I remember the exact moment I thought my life was perfect. Charlotte stood beside me in the small bakery on Oxford Street, holding a fork with a piece of vanilla cake on it. "Try this one, Oliver," she said with a bright smile. "This could be our wedding cake." I laughed and leaned closer. "Charlotte, we've already tried 6 cakes. If I eat another slice, I might not fit into my suit." She nudged my shoulder playfully. "Don't be dramatic. This is important." I tasted the cake and nodded slowly. "All right, this one is good." She clapped her hands softly. "See? I knew it." Watching her excitement filled me with warmth. "You're really enjoying this planning thing?" I said. She looked at me with soft eyes. "Of course I am. I've been dreaming about our wedding for months." Hearing that made my chest feel light. I truly believed everything between us was strong and certain. Later that afternoon, we visited a small venue near the river. Charlotte walked through the garden while talking nonstop. "The ceremony could happen right here," she said, pointing toward an arch covered in flowers. "And the reception tables could be over there." I followed her, smiling at how passionate she sounded. "You've thought about every detail," I said. She turned toward me. "It's our wedding, Oliver." "Of course I have." I slipped my hands into my pockets and joked, "So my job is just to show up and say, 'I do'?" She laughed. "Exactly." We walked together along the path and she suddenly grabbed my arm. "Can you believe it's only 3 months away?" I shook my head slowly. "Honestly? No. It feels like yesterday we met." She squeezed my arm. "Best decision of my life." I looked at her face and believed every word she said. That evening we went to my mother's house for dinner. Sophie was already there when we arrived. She hugged Charlotte politely but gave me a small look I couldn't understand. During dinner, Charlotte talked excitedly about decorations. "I'm thinking white roses and silver lights," she said. My mother smiled warmly. "That sounds beautiful." Sophie took a sip of water and glanced at Charlotte. "You've been traveling a lot lately though," she said. "How do you find time for wedding planning?" Charlotte shrugged casually. "Work conferences. Winter season is busy in event planning." Sophie frowned slightly. "You were in London last weekend, right?" Charlotte nodded. "Yes, business meeting." Sophie looked at me. "Oliver, you're all right with her traveling so much?" I laughed softly. "Of course. Her job requires it." Sophie leaned back in her chair but still looked uneasy. "I'm just saying, wedding planning can be stressful." Charlotte smiled calmly. "Don't worry, Sophie. I can handle both." I reached for Charlotte's hand under the table. "I trust her," I said simply. Over the next few weeks, life felt like a constant rush of plans and excitement. Charlotte would sit beside me on the sofa with her laptop open. "Look at these invitation designs," she said one evening. I leaned closer to the screen. "That one looks elegant." She tilted her head. "The gold lettering?" I nodded. "Yes, it feels classic." She smiled proudly. "Good. I thought the same." Sometimes she would receive calls late at night and step into another room. When I asked about it, she always answered calmly. "Work stuff, Oliver. Clients never sleep." Once she canceled dinner suddenly and said she needed to fly out for a weekend conference. "I'll be back Monday," she promised while packing her bag. I kissed her cheek and told her not to worry. "Just focus on your work." Even when the trips started happening more often, I convinced myself it was normal. Planning a wedding while managing a busy career couldn't be easy. One night in early January, Charlotte sat beside me again with a tablet in her hands. "I finished the invitation design," she said proudly. I leaned closer. "Let me see." The design was beautiful, simple white paper with elegant gold letters announcing our March wedding. "It's perfect," I told her honestly. She smiled brightly. "I knew you'd like it." While she held the tablet, her phone lit up on the table beside her. I didn't mean to look, but the screen caught my attention. A message appeared with only one letter showing as the sender. Can't wait to see you again." Charlotte quickly grabbed the phone and turned it face down. I tried to ignore the strange feeling that suddenly settled in my chest, but the excitement I felt only moments ago quietly faded. The message from M stayed in my mind longer than I wanted to admit. I tried to ignore it, but the next morning Charlotte was already packing a small suitcase. "Another conference?" I asked while watching her zip the bag. She nodded quickly. "Yes, just a weekend one in London. I'll be back Sunday night." I leaned against the doorframe and crossed my arms. "You've been traveling a lot lately." She smiled in that calm, reassuring way she always used. "It's winter season, Oliver. Events everywhere." I walked closer and kissed her cheek. "All right. Just don't work too hard." She laughed softly. Someone has to pay for this wedding. I forced a small smile, but the strange feeling from the night before still sat quietly in my chest. When she left the apartment, I told myself I was being paranoid. Charlotte had never given me a reason not to trust her. At least that's what I kept repeating to myself. That afternoon I met my best friend James at a small cafe near my office. He sat across from me, stirring his coffee. "So," he said casually, "how's wedding planning going?" I smiled. "Stressful but exciting." He nodded. "Charlotte traveling again?" I shrugged. "Conference in London this weekend." James raised an eyebrow and pulled out his phone. "London?" he said slowly. "That's strange." I frowned slightly. "Why?" He turned the phone toward me. Her social media story popped up earlier. "Look." I leaned forward and saw a photo of snowy mountains and a ski lift in the background. My stomach tightened. "That's not London." James shook his head. "Definitely not." I leaned back in my chair and laughed awkwardly. "Maybe it's an old photo." James studied my face. "Maybe. But the location tag says Aspen Heights Resort." I stared at the phone for a moment before pushing it gently back toward him. "She probably posted something random," I said. "Charlotte wouldn't lie about something like that." James didn't argue, but the look in his eyes told me he wasn't convinced. That evening curiosity refused to leave me alone. I opened Charlotte's social media page and scrolled through her recent posts. Most of them were harmless. Wedding inspiration photos, decoration ideas, short captions about excitement. But when I looked closer at older stories saved in highlights, I noticed something strange. Snowy landscapes, luxury hotel lobbies, ski lifts. I frowned at the screen and whispered to myself, why didn't she tell me about these trips? I sent a quick message to James. "You still there?" He replied almost instantly. "Yeah." "Something wrong?" I called him instead of typing. "James," I said quietly, "I think you were right." He sighed softly. "What did you find?" I explained the photos. He listened carefully before speaking again. "Oliver, how long have these trips been happening?" I scrolled further back through her profile. "Since December," I said slowly. "Maybe even earlier." There was a brief silence on the line. Then James said gently, "You might want to ask her directly." I stared at the screen again, but the thought of confronting Charlotte made my chest tighten. The next day Sophie came over to my apartment unexpectedly. She walked in, looked around, and asked, "Charlotte still traveling?" I nodded. "Conference." Sophie hesitated before speaking again. "Oliver, can I ask you something?" I sat on the sofa and gestured for her to continue. She sat across from me and crossed her arms. "A few weeks ago, I saw Charlotte leaving a hotel downtown." I frowned. "That's not strange." Sophie shook her head slowly. "She wasn't alone." My heart skipped slightly. "What do you mean?" Sophie looked directly into my eyes. "She walked out with a man. They looked close." I immediately shook my head. "You must be mistaken." Sophie sighed. "I hoped I was." I stood up and began pacing the room. "Charlotte wouldn't do that," I said firmly. "We're getting married in March." Sophie's voice softened. "I'm not accusing her. I'm just telling you what I saw." I stopped walking and looked at the floor, trying to silence the doubt growing inside my mind. That night I sat alone in the living room staring at my phone. Charlotte hadn't called yet. My thoughts kept repeating the same questions. Why the ski resort? Why the hotel? Who was the man Sophie saw? I rubbed my face and whispered, "This is ridiculous." Just then my phone buzzed with a notification. A message from an unknown number appeared on the screen. My fingers hesitated before opening it. There was no text, only a single photo. My chest tightened as the image loaded. Charlotte stood outside a snowy resort building, laughing brightly. Beside her was a tall man wearing a dark winter coat. His arm rested comfortably around her waist as if it belonged there. I stared at the screen in silence while a cold feeling slowly spread through my chest. I barely slept after seeing the photo. The next morning I called James. "I'm going there," I said quietly. He sounded confused. "Going where?" I stared at the picture again. "The resort. Aspen Heights." James was silent for a moment. "Oliver, are you sure?" I exhaled slowly. "No. But I need to know the truth." He sighed. "All right. Call me when you get there." The flight felt longer than it should have. My mind kept repeating the same thought. There must be an explanation. Charlotte loved me. We were planning a wedding. People didn't destroy their future like that. When I finally reached the resort, Cold wind hit my face as I stepped outside. I walked into the lodge, my heart beating harder with every step. "Excuse me," I said to the receptionist. "I'm looking for Charlotte Hayes." The woman glanced at her screen. "She checked in yesterday." My chest tightened. "Which room?" She hesitated politely. "I can't give that information." I nodded slowly and forced a smile. "That's all right." I walked through the lobby pretending to check my phone while quietly scanning the room. Couples sat near the fireplace, laughing and drinking coffee. For a moment I almost convinced myself the photo had been misleading. Then I saw her. Charlotte sat on a sofa near the window, wearing a white sweater and laughing softly. Beside her sat a tall man with dark hair and a confident smile. His arm rested casually along the back of the sofa, close to her shoulders. My chest felt like someone had tightened a rope around it. I walked toward them before I could change my mind. "Charlotte," I said. My voice sounded calmer than I expected. She looked up and froze. "Oliver?" Her eyes widened. "What are you doing here?" I stood in front of them, staring at the man beside her. "I think the better question is, what are you doing here?" The man looked at me with mild curiosity. "Friend of yours?" he asked Charlotte. She quickly stood up. "Oliver, this isn't what you think." I crossed my arms slowly. "Then explain." Charlotte pulled me a few steps away from the sofa. "Why are you here?" she whispered urgently. I held up my phone and showed her the photo. "Because someone sent me this." Her face lost color instantly. "Oliver, listen to me." I shook my head. "No. You listen." I pointed toward the man still sitting behind us. "Who is he?" Charlotte glanced over her shoulder nervously. "He's just a client." I laughed bitterly. "A client who holds you like that?" The man suddenly stood and walked closer. "I'm Marcus," he said calmly, extending his hand toward me. I didn't take it. "Marcus Reed." He shrugged and lowered his hand. "Charlotte didn't mention you'd show up." I stared at him coldly. "She probably didn't mention she's engaged either." Marcus smirked slightly. "Oh, I know she's engaged." My stomach dropped. I looked at Charlotte. "You told him?" She shook her head quickly. "Oliver, please." Marcus interrupted with a casual shrug. "Relax. It's not a secret. Charlotte and I have been seeing each other for months." My chest felt hollow. "Months?" I repeated quietly. Charlotte grabbed my arm. "Don't listen to him." Marcus leaned against the table beside him, watching us like the situation entertained him. "December, right?" he said casually. "That's when we met." My mind flashed through every winter weekend Charlotte claimed she had work conferences. I looked at her slowly. "Tell me he's lying." She looked down at the floor instead of answering. My voice broke slightly. "Charlotte, tell me." She finally spoke in a quiet voice. "Oliver, it doesn't mean anything." I stared at her in disbelief. "Doesn't mean anything?" She nodded quickly. "It was a mistake. Just excitement. It doesn't change how I feel about you." Marcus laughed softly behind us. "That's not exactly how you explained it to me." Charlotte shot him an angry look. "Marcus, stop." I felt my hands trembling. "So while we were choosing wedding invitations," I said slowly, "you were coming here with him?" She reached for my hand. "Oliver, please. The wedding can still happen." I pulled my hand away. "You think this changes nothing?" Her eyes filled with tears. "I made a mistake. But I love you." Marcus crossed his arms and watched us. "You should hear how she talks about our weekends," he said casually. "Very romantic." Charlotte shouted, "Marcus, enough." I felt something inside me collapse quietly. Every promise she had ever made suddenly felt empty. "You said our wedding was the happiest moment of your life," I said. She whispered, "It still can be." I shook my head slowly. "You destroyed that moment yourself." Neither of them spoke as I turned toward the door. My chest felt heavy but strangely calm. Charlotte followed a few steps behind me. "Oliver, please don't leave like this," she said desperately. I stopped near the entrance and looked back at her. "You already left," I said quietly. "Just not physically." Marcus stood in the background with a faint smile that made my stomach twist with humiliation. I walked outside without another word. Snow had begun falling heavily across the resort grounds. Cold wind hit my face as I stood there alone. I looked up at the gray sky and whispered to myself, the woman planning my wedding was building another life. The flight home felt longer than any journey I had ever taken. When I walked into my apartment, everything looked the same, yet nothing felt the same. I dropped my bag beside the sofa and stared at the silent room. My phone buzzed almost immediately. Charlotte's name flashed on the screen. I let it ring. Then another message appeared. Oliver, please answer. We need to talk. I whispered to myself, what's left to talk about? Before I could think further, my phone rang again. This time it was James. I answered quietly. You saw her? He asked without greeting. I exhaled slowly. Yeah. There was a pause. And? I laughed bitterly. And everything you suspected was true. James spoke carefully. Oliver, are you all right? I rubbed my forehead. No, I'm not. He didn't try to comfort me with empty words. Instead he said firmly, then cancel the wedding. I stayed silent. James continued, you don't marry someone who lies to your face. My voice came out weak. It's not that simple. James replied, actually it is. Later that evening I went to my mother's house. Sophie opened the door and immediately studied my face. You look awful, she said. I walked inside slowly. I found her, I said quietly. My mother looked up from the kitchen table. Found who? Sophie already understood. Charlotte, she whispered. I nodded. At a resort. My mother frowned. But she said she was working in London. I sat down heavily and spoke without looking at them. She wasn't alone. Sophie crossed her arms angrily. I knew it. My mother's voice trembled. Oliver, what happened? I swallowed before answering. She's been seeing someone else. Sophie slammed her hand on the table. That woman had the nerve to plan a wedding with you while doing this? My mother looked heartbroken. Did she explain anything? I shook my head slowly. She tried. I didn't listen. Sophie paced the room. Good. She doesn't deserve the chance. My mother reached across the table and held my hand gently. My son, you deserve honesty. I forced a small smile. I thought I had it. Over the next 2 days Charlotte called constantly. My phone filled with missed calls and messages. Oliver, please talk to me. It's not what it looks like. I love you. Each message made my chest tighten with anger and confusion. I showed my phone to James when we met again. He stared at the screen and shook his head. Don't respond. I sighed deeply. She keeps saying it meant nothing. James leaned forward. Nothing? She had months of secret trips. I looked down at the table. I keep thinking about our wedding plans. James frowned. Those plans were built on lies. I rubbed my face slowly. I don't understand how someone can promise a future while hiding something like that. James' voice softened. Because some people care more about excitement than loyalty. I sat silently, letting his words sink in. That evening my phone buzzed again. This time there was a new message. I'm outside your apartment. Please let me explain. My stomach tightened immediately. I walked to the window and saw Charlotte standing near the entrance. She looked tired, her eyes red. I opened the door slowly a few minutes later. She stepped inside and whispered, "Thank you for letting me come." I crossed my arms. "Talk." She wiped her eyes quickly. "Oliver, what happened with Marcus was a mistake." I stared at her. "A mistake that lasted months?" She shook her head desperately. "It wasn't serious." I laughed quietly. "You traveled across the country to meet him." She stepped closer. "It was just excitement. Something temporary." I felt anger rising inside my chest. "Temporary?" I repeated. "You planned our wedding while sleeping with someone else." Tears rolled down her cheeks. "I still want our wedding." I stared at her in disbelief. "After everything?" She nodded quickly. "Yes. I love you, Oliver." I shook my head slowly. "Love doesn't look like what you did." Charlotte continued crying. "Please don't throw everything away," she said. "We've built a life together." I walked toward the window, trying to control the storm inside my chest. "You built 2 lives," I replied quietly. She whispered behind me, "Marcus meant nothing." I turned around slowly. "Then why risk everything for him?" She opened her mouth but couldn't answer. The silence between us felt heavier than any argument. Finally she said softly, "We can fix this." I looked at her for a long moment. My voice came out calm but distant. "I need time." Charlotte nodded weakly, wiping her tears again. "I'll wait." I watched her leave the apartment a few minutes later. The door closed softly behind her, but something inside me had already closed much harder. The weeks after Charlotte's visit felt strange. At first the apartment felt empty, but slowly the silence became peaceful instead of painful. One evening James sat across from me in the living room holding 2 cups of coffee. "You look better," he said while handing one to me. I shrugged slightly. "Better than before." He studied my face for a moment. Has Charlotte stopped calling? I laughed quietly. Not even close. My phone buzzed again on the table, almost proving my point. James glanced at it and smirked. Speak of the devil. I turned the screen toward him. Another message from Charlotte. Oliver, please talk to me. We can still fix this. James leaned back. You still thinking about the wedding? I stared at the message before locking the screen. I don't know what I'm thinking anymore. He took a slow sip of coffee. Then maybe it's time you start thinking about who Marcus Reed really is. I frowned slightly. What do you mean? James reached into his bag and pulled out his tablet. I got curious, he said. Did some digging. I leaned forward as he opened several articles and social media posts. Marcus Reed, he explained, rich family, flashy lifestyle, lots of parties. I nodded slowly. That part one could guess. James scrolled further. But look closer. I read a few comments under an article about Marcus's business investments. Several people mentioned broken relationships and rumors. What is this? I asked quietly. James tapped the screen. Different women accusing him of the same thing. My stomach tightened. Using them? James nodded. Exactly. Charming them, showing them luxury, then disappearing when he gets bored. I leaned back slowly. Charlotte thought she was special. James raised an eyebrow. From what I see, she wasn't the first. I stared at the screen, feeling something inside me shift from pain to cold understanding. Charlotte continued calling almost every day. One afternoon I finally answered. Oliver, she said quickly, her voice full of relief. Thank God you picked up. I stayed quiet for a moment before speaking. What do you want, Charlotte? She sounded nervous. I just want to talk. Please. I sighed. We've already talked. She rushed her words. I know, but things can still work. The wedding is only weeks away. I felt a strange calmness while listening to her. You're still thinking about the wedding? She hesitated. Of course. It's our future. I replied quietly. You risked that future. She whispered, Marcus meant nothing. I leaned against the wall and said slowly, I'm starting to believe that. She sounded hopeful. Then we can fix things. I closed my eyes for a second. No, Charlotte. I believe he meant nothing to you, the same way our promises meant nothing when you broke them. She fell silent. I added softly, You're not sorry for cheating. You're sorry you got caught. Her breathing grew heavier, but she didn't argue. A few days later, Daniel, Charlotte's older brother, asked to meet me. We sat across from each other in a quiet pub. He looked uncomfortable as he stirred his drink. I heard what happened, he said finally. I nodded. I'm sure Charlotte told her version. Daniel sighed. She didn't deny it. I raised my eyebrows slightly. That's honest at least. He looked directly at me. I warned her about Marcus months ago. My hands tightened around my glass. You knew? He nodded slowly. Marcus has a reputation. I shook my head in disbelief. And she still chose him? Daniel looked frustrated. She thought it was harmless. Just excitement. I laughed bitterly. That word again. Daniel leaned forward. For what it's worth, Oliver, you didn't deserve this. I studied his face for a moment before replying. No one deserves it. He nodded quietly. I told her she was making a mistake. She didn't listen. Over the next week, small rumors about Marcus began appearing online. James showed me another article while we sat in his car. Look at this, he said. The headline mentioned a canceled investment deal connected to Marcus's company. I frowned. What happened? James shrugged. Seems like some partners don't trust him anymore. I stared at the screen. Because of the rumors? James nodded. Money people hate scandals. I leaned back in my seat thinking about everything I had learned. Charlotte had risked our future for a man who treated relationships like temporary entertainment. James watched my expression carefully. You're quiet, he said. I finally spoke. Because I'm realizing something. He tilted his head. What? I looked straight ahead and said calmly, I'm done reacting to their choices. James raised an eyebrow. Meaning? I took a slow breath. Meaning I'm about to make a decision that changes everything. The closer March came, the calmer I felt. A month ago my thoughts had been chaos, but now my mind felt sharp and focused. One afternoon James sat across from me in my office while I reviewed documents on my laptop. You've been very quiet lately, he said. I looked up and replied calmly, quiet doesn't mean inactive. He leaned forward slightly. You found more about Marcus? I nodded and turned the laptop toward him. Messages, travel records, photos, Not just with Charlotte. James whistled softly. That's a lot of women. I closed the screen slowly. Marcus enjoys attention. James crossed his arms. And Charlotte thought she was special. I shrugged lightly. She thought she was choosing excitement over stability. James looked at me carefully. So what's the plan? I leaned back in my chair. Today the wedding invitations were supposed to be confirmed. He raised an eyebrow. Meaning Charlotte will show up. I nodded. Exactly. James smiled faintly. I almost feel sorry for her. I replied quietly, I don't. Right on time my office door opened. Charlotte stepped inside holding a folder. Oliver, she said with a nervous smile. I'm glad you agreed to meet. I gestured toward the chair across from my desk. Sit. She sat down and placed the folder in front of me. These are the final invitation drafts, she explained. If we confirm them today, everything will stay on schedule for March. I watched her calmly for a moment. She looked hopeful, almost relieved. You really believe this wedding is still happening? I asked. She nodded quickly. Of course. You said you needed time and I gave you that. I folded my hands together on the desk. Charlotte, time doesn't erase truth. She frowned slightly. What does that mean? Instead of answering immediately, I opened a drawer and placed a stack of printed pages on the desk between us. It means I've been learning more about Marcus Reed. Her eyes widened slightly. Why? I pushed the papers toward her. Because understanding someone helps explain their choices. She picked up the pages slowly, her hands beginning to tremble. Charlotte flipped through the documents while her face lost color. Oliver, where did you get these? She whispered. I leaned forward slightly. Messages from multiple women, hotel records, travel bookings. She shook her head nervously. This isn't relevant to us. I almost laughed. Not relevant? She pointed at the papers. This is Marcus's life, not mine. I looked directly into her eyes. You were part of that life. Charlotte's voice rose suddenly. It meant nothing. I stayed calm. You said that before. She stood up from the chair. Then why are you digging into this? I replied quietly, because I wanted the full truth. Her breathing became faster. Marcus manipulated me, she said quickly. He lied about everything. I tilted my head slightly. So now it's his fault? She slammed the papers back onto my desk. Yes. He convinced me things were harmless. I leaned back again and said calmly, Charlotte, you traveled with him willingly. She looked desperate now. But I chose you in the end. I replied, you didn't choose me. You got caught. Her shoulders dropped as my words settled in the room. For a moment neither of us spoke. Then Charlotte whispered, we can still fix this. I shook my head slowly. There's nothing left to fix. She walked closer to the desk. Oliver, please, think about everything we planned. I met her gaze without hesitation. I have. Just then my phone buzzed on the desk. I glanced at the screen and saw a news alert. James had sent the same link seconds later. Charlotte noticed my expression. What is it? She asked nervously. I turned the phone toward her. The headline read, Business partners cut ties with Marcus Reed after scandal reports. Charlotte stared at the screen, her face completely pale. What does this mean? She whispered. I shrugged calmly. It means rumors travel fast. She looked stunned. His company, deals are collapsing? I nodded slightly. Investors don't like scandals involving multiple affairs and manipulation. Charlotte slowly sat back down, staring at the headline as if the ground beneath her had disappeared. After a long silence she finally looked up at me. Oliver, she said quietly, everything is falling apart. I studied her expression carefully. Weeks ago I would have felt sympathy, but now my thoughts were clear. You built your choices on unstable ground, I replied. She shook her head slowly. I thought I could have both worlds. I answered calmly, most people who try that lose both. Her eyes filled with tears. The wedding, she began softly. I interrupted before she could finish. There will be no wedding. She froze in place. You're serious? I nodded once. Completely. Charlotte stared at me as if seeing a stranger. You're really walking away. I stood up slowly and said the words that had been waiting for weeks. No, Charlotte. I'm finally walking forward. The weeks after I canceled the wedding felt strangely calm. One afternoon James sat across from me at a quiet cafe, watching me carefully. You seem different, he said. I stirred my coffee slowly. Different how? He shrugged. Less angry. I thought about that for a moment before answering. Anger takes too much energy. James nodded slightly. So you're really moving on? I gave a small smile. Trying to. He leaned forward. Have you heard anything about Charlotte? I hesitated. A little. James raised an eyebrow. From who? I tapped my phone on the table. Daniel called me yesterday. James whistled quietly. That must have been awkward. I shrugged. Not really. He sounded tired. James leaned back in his chair. What did he say? I took a slow breath. Marcus disappeared. James blinked. Disappeared? I nodded. Apparently when those business rumors started spreading, he cut contact with Charlotte completely. James shook his head slowly. That's brutal. I stared at my coffee for a second. It's exactly the kind of person he always was. Later that evening I met Emily, James's wife, at a small restaurant near my office. She smiled kindly as I sat down. James told me you've been handling everything well, she said. I laughed softly. That depends on your definition of well. She folded her hands on the table. You look calmer. I nodded slightly. I think the shock is gone. Emily tilted her head. Do you still miss her? The question caught me off guard. I thought carefully before answering. I miss who I believed she was. Emily nodded with understanding. That makes sense. I looked at her and asked quietly, do you think forgiveness means letting someone back into your life? She shook her head gently. No. Forgiveness sometimes just means letting go of the anger. I leaned back in my chair, considering her words. I think I'm starting to understand that. Emily smiled softly. Betrayal hurts, but it also shows you what you deserve. I nodded slowly. Respect. She added, and dignity. A few days later my phone rang again with Charlotte's name on the screen. I stared at it for several seconds before answering. Hello. My voice sounded calm. Charlotte spoke quietly on the other end. Oliver, thank you for picking up. I leaned against the wall of my office. What do you want to say? She paused before replying. I heard about Marcus. I said nothing. She continued, he won't answer my calls anymore. I finally responded. That's unfortunate. Her voice sounded fragile. Oliver, I was stupid. I closed my eyes for a moment. You already told me that. She sighed heavily. I thought I was in control. I replied calmly, you thought you could keep both lives. There was a long silence. Then she whispered, maybe I deserve everything happening now. I didn't answer right away. Finally I said quietly, actions have consequences. She didn't argue with that. 2 days later Daniel called again. She's not doing well, he said immediately. I leaned back in my chair. What happened? Daniel sighed deeply. Marcus cut her off completely. Some of his business partners dropped him too, so now he's protecting himself. I nodded slowly even though Daniel couldn't see me. That sounds like Marcus. Daniel hesitated before speaking again. Charlotte keeps saying she ruined everything. I stayed silent. Daniel continued, she tried to blame Marcus at first but I told her the truth. I asked quietly, what truth? Daniel's voice became firm. That she made her own choices. I respected him more for saying that. After a moment he added, she might try talking to you again. I replied calmly, she already has. Daniel exhaled slowly. Oliver, you don't owe her anything. I said quietly, I know. That evening I stopped by the church where the wedding ceremony had originally been scheduled. I wasn't sure why I went there. Maybe I just wanted to see the place one last time. The doors were unlocked and the building was almost empty. As I stepped inside, I heard a familiar voice behind me. Oliver. My body froze for a moment before I turned around. Charlotte stood near the entrance, her eyes red from crying. I didn't expect to see you here, she said softly. I looked around the quiet church before answering. Neither did I. She took a few steps closer. I come here sometimes now. I frowned slightly. Why? She looked down at the floor. Because this is where our life was supposed to begin. I studied her face carefully. For the first time since everything happened, she looked completely broken. Charlotte looked back at me and whispered, can we talk? The church doors were already open when I arrived. For a moment I stood outside staring at the building where my wedding was supposed to happen. The silence around it felt strange. A few months ago this place was supposed to be filled with family, music, and promises. Now it was empty. I stepped inside slowly and saw Charlotte sitting in the front row. She looked smaller somehow, like the confidence she once carried had disappeared. When she noticed me, she stood up immediately. Oliver, you came, she said quietly. I kept my voice calm. You asked to meet here. She nodded nervously. I thought this place deserved honesty. I looked around the quiet church and replied, it deserved honesty from the beginning. Charlotte walked a few steps closer but kept a distance between us. I know, she said softly. I've had a lot of time to think. I crossed my arms and waited. She looked down at the floor before speaking again. Marcus left, she admitted. I didn't react. She continued, when the scandal started, he stopped answering my calls. I said quietly, that doesn't surprise me. She nodded slowly. Daniel told me the same thing. He said Marcus only stays when things are easy. I watched her carefully as she added, I thought I could control everything. I tilted my head slightly. You thought you could keep 2 lives. Charlotte swallowed. Yes. Her honesty sounded different now, less defensive. And I destroyed both. For a moment neither of us spoke. Then she looked directly at me and said, I'm sorry, Oliver. Not just for getting caught, but for betraying you. I studied her face while she spoke. The confidence she once had was gone, replaced with something fragile. You finally understand the difference, I said quietly. Charlotte nodded. Before I kept saying it meant nothing, she admitted. But that wasn't true. I frowned slightly. Then what did it mean? She took a slow breath before answering. It meant I was selfish. Her voice trembled slightly. I wanted excitement without consequences. I stayed silent, letting her continue. You offered stability, loyalty, a future, she said. Marcus offered attention and thrill. She looked up at me again. I chose the wrong thing. I replied calmly, you chose it many times. She closed her eyes briefly as if my words hurt, but she didn't argue. You're right, she said softly. Charlotte sat down on the wooden bench and gestured for me to sit as well. After a moment I sat on the opposite side of the aisle, keeping distance between us. I don't expect forgiveness, she said quietly. I answered honestly, I'm not angry anymore. She looked surprised. You're not. I shook my head slightly. Anger fades when truth becomes clear. She stared at the floor for a moment. I wish I understood that earlier. I leaned back against the bench and said calmly, so do I. She looked toward the altar at the front of the church. I imagined walking down this aisle with you, she said quietly. I imagined saying those vows. I followed her gaze for a moment before replying. I imagined it too. She whispered, I ruined it. I didn't deny it. After a long silence she asked the question I knew was coming. Is there any chance for us now? I looked at her carefully before answering. Charlotte, trust isn't like a broken plate you can glue back together. She listened quietly while I continued. Once it shatters, the cracks always remain. Her eyes filled with tears again. I know, she said. But part of me hoped. Her voice faded before finishing the sentence. I spoke gently but firmly. Hope doesn't erase choices. She nodded slowly. You're stronger than I expected, she admitted. I gave a small smile. I didn't realize it either. She wiped her eyes and whispered, you deserved better than what I gave you. I replied simply, everyone deserves honesty. Charlotte stood up again and looked around the empty church. This place was supposed to hold the beginning of our life together, she said quietly. I stood as well. Maybe it still holds a beginning, I replied. She looked confused. For you, I added calmly. She studied my face before asking softly, and what about you? I walked slowly toward the door while answering. For me, it's the end of an illusion. She followed a few steps behind but stopped before reaching the exit. Oliver, she said quietly. I turned back one last time. Thank you for coming today, she said. I nodded once. Goodbye, Charlotte. When I stepped outside the church, the air felt lighter than it had in months. My phone buzzed in my pocket and I saw a message from James asking if I was all right. I typed back quickly. Yes. Everything is finally clear. As I walked away from the church, I realized something important. The life I imagined with Charlotte had only existed in my hopes, not in reality. Losing that illusion didn't destroy me. Instead, it freed me. For the first time since winter began, I felt ready to move forward into a future built on truth rather than promises that were never real.